It has been said that knowledge is power. Learning new things gives people the power to acquire new skills and abilities. Knowledge can equip people to improve their situation and give their families a better life. Knowledge can also give people power over other people. What authorities and news sources tell us shapes the way we think about the world. It doesn't just influence our opinion on things like moral issues, but it can change what we accept as facts. For instance, there are people who sincerely believe that the Earth is flat and that man has not landed on the moon. This is their belief because they've been influenced by people they view as authorities on the subject. The vast amount of information available to us has the ability to empower us and improve our lives, but it also has the potential to mislead us. We've talked about the importance of critical thinking when it comes to doing research and analyzing new information. This does not mean thinking negatively about all new information. It means taking into consideration our personal bias, the bias of those who present this information, and all the circumstances that define how we should use it. Public news sources are a great source of factual information, but they have increasingly come under attack for spreading misleading or false information. Sometimes this is done intentionally, and sometimes unintentionally. Some of the most prominent news sources worldwide are CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, USA Today, The Associated Press, Reuters, National Public Radio, and Al Jazeera News. Millions of people rely on these news sources for accurate information and to make decisions. What do you think of when you think of these sources? Imagine putting these news sources on a chart. The left side of the chart is for accurate news sources, and the right side of the chart is for inaccurate news sources. On which side would you put each of these sources? These news sources have built a reputation on providing accurate, up-to-date information. And now imagine another chart with the same news sources. This time, the left side is labeled biased and the right side is labeled unbiased. Now, where would you put each of these sources? In the United States media, there's been a lot of talk not only about whether a news source is biased or not, but also which way they're biased. There's talk about conservatives versus liberals, left versus right, even communist versus capitalist viewpoints. People may dismiss the accuracy of a news report because of the bias of the source, saying it's too left or it's too right. Let's look at our news sources again. Where would you put them if the left side is labeled left or liberal and the right side was labeled right or conservative? In order to educate and protect people, watchdog groups have emerged like All Sides and Pew Research. These groups have tried to quantify the bias or political leaning of a news source. They do this by means of surveys and analysis to try to determine the bias of each source. Not surprisingly, their results have been fiercely contested. Whether or not people accept information from a news source often depends on their own personal bias. If the news source seems slanted towards an opinion that is the opposite of what someone believes, they tend to think that it's inaccurate or biased. One of the biggest reasons that people think that the media is biased comes from the media itself. News sources point fingers at their rivals and point out why the other source is biased. As a result, surveys in the United States say that most Americans think that the news is inaccurate and biased. Can we trust the media? Let's look at a video that will help us with this question.
Liberal or conservative, male or female, young or old, Americans love to bash the news media. Once among the nation's most trusted institutions, the news media have fallen from grace. According to Gallup, even as recently as 2000, a majority of Americans trusted the press. By 2015, it had fallen to 40%, and lower than that, 36% among those 18 to 49. It's hard to see how this decline will be reversed. The industry has become politically polarized, and in the highly competitive age of multiple 24-hour cable news channels and the internet, It's under severe financial pressure. And this compounds an even deeper problem: failing journalistic standards. In the 1950s, the media universe consisted mainly of a few national television broadcast networks and local TV and radio stations, most of which got much of their news from major wire services in the nation's large newspapers. Most journalists were committed to producing objective journalism, fact-based stories independent of the government and of political parties. A reporter's job was to report, not offer opinion or advocate. Presented with the facts, it was up to readers to make their own judgments about news events. Opinions were supposed to be confined to editorial and op-ed pages. That world no longer exists. This lack of objectivity and the decline of standards is one reason, though not the only one, why newspapers and news magazines are a declining industry. According to Pew Research, print revenue from newspaper sales has declined from $47 billion in 2006 to $16 billion in 2014. Digital sales haven't come close to making up the difference. Most papers have been forced to cut operating expenses, slash staff, and close bureaus, overseas in particular. Ironically, there are more stories than ever to cover, and fewer staff than ever to cover them. This lack of information from professional journalists has been filled by a new source: social media and the blogosphere. When the Iraq War, which I covered for the New York Times, began in 2003, there were roughly 100,000 bloggers. Only a few years later, there were an estimated 27 million. The Internet as a news source has obvious pluses and minuses. On the plus side is that information is spread widely and instantly. The minuses have to do with the fact that the quality of reporting varies dramatically. It's not easy to separate the wheat from the chaff. Furthermore, many sites, including mainstream sites, have abandoned traditional journalistic practices and standards in search of more and more eyeballs. Objectivity, once the gold standard of reporting, is now often seen as old-fashioned, a ratings loser. When success is measured mainly in terms of clicks, the outrageous beats the sober just about every time. Inserting opinion, even in the middle of a news story, is a way in which journalists can distinguish themselves. And in mainstream media outlets, those opinions overwhelmingly tend to be liberal. This might not be so bad if journalists acknowledged their bias, but they almost never do. Yet the bias is obvious. A decline in revenue, an increase in bias have made many wary of the people who provide them with their news. A certain amount of skepticism is a healthy thing. People may like to bash the media. Most people would far prefer to trust it. I'm Judith Miller, contributing editor of City Journal for Prager University.
So people are very skeptical about information that comes from news sources. Interestingly, the number one obstacle towards getting reliable information from the news is probably not the bias or accuracy of the news source, but our own personal bias. Let's watch a video that alerts us to a major personal bias that we all have. Knowing about this bias can help us avoid prejudicing ourselves against information we get from news.
What if falling for fake news isn't about intelligence or how much information you have? What if we're hardwired to believe what we want to believe, regardless of the facts? The 2016 presidential election saw fake news come out of nowhere. A BuzzFeed analysis showed that the top 20 fake news articles on Facebook generated more clicks than the top 20 real articles from every major publication combined. They were shared millions of times. And it's not that we're just sharing fake news, we appear to be believing the stories too. A recent poll found that people believe fake news articles were somewhat or very accurate 75% of the time. How can we be falling for fake news when we have these things? We have instant access to more information than we've ever had before. Debunking misinformation should be a piece of cake, right? Decades of brain research say, no. Turns out, our brains have other plans. A little something called cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is defined as a limitation in our thinking that can cause flaws in our judgment. It's kind of like an annoying brain glitch that can lead us to make faulty conclusions. Fake news often exploits this, and our brains love it, even if we're not conscious of it happening. Once we form conclusions, they're hard to change, even if we're presented with facts or evidence that directly contradict those conclusions. So what exactly is going on in our brains to make us think that fake news is real news? Why can't facts change our minds? There are many flavors of cognitive bias, but one of the most researched is confirmation bias. We seek out information that we believe or want to believe is true. It also leads us to ignore or minimize facts that threaten what we believe. So here's a study that explains how it works. Back in 2004, during the Kerry Bush election, researchers studied a group of 30 people, half Democrat, half Republican. Both candidates did what politicians do. They flip-flopped on the issues. Then the study asked the participants to analyze what the candidates said. The participants let the candidate in their own party off the hook, but were super critical of the candidate in the other party. When researchers looked at their brain scans, they found that the area of the brain responsible for reason, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, was inactive. So people weren't using reason when evaluating the candidates they liked, but they were using the part of the brain that processes emotion, the orbital frontal cortex, a classic case of confirmation bias. And their brains were also rewarding them with the rush of dopamine, a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good. So is there any upside to confirmation bias? Well, it could help protect us from ideas that may threaten our social standing in our tribe. Dan Kahan, a law and psychology professor at Yale University, calls it identity protective cognition. We humans are hypersocial, so it's more important to protect our values in our relationships with family and friends than it is to risk losing that by adopting new beliefs. Are you familiar with Tomi Lahren? She's a conservative political commentator.
A protest is a peaceful objection to a grievance. A bunch of sore losers occupying a space is called a tantrum.
But recently, she expressed her pro-choice view on abortion.
No, I'm pro-choice, and here's why.
As a result, members of her conservative tribe turned on her. Ouch. So, how do we defeat confirmation bias? Well, you really can't, but our 3-step plan can help you get around it. Step 1 is recognize. Recognize that you have this bias in the first place. We all do. You made it this far in the video, so you can check that one off. Step 2 is consider. Consider that you may not really understand what you think you understand. Researchers call it the illusion of explanatory depth. Let's say I strongly believe that GMOs are bad for me. If someone forces me to explain it, I just might realize that I don't understand it as well as I thought I did. Now, I might be less confident in my belief and more receptive to another point of view. Step 3 is research. Research and break down the opposing viewpoint. You may realize that your understanding of where they're coming from is a bit too shallow. So now you know the perils of confirmation bias and have some tools to beat it. Let's try it out. Pick a controversial topic and use step 3 on it. Don't try to persuade, but instead use research and facts to lay out why the other side believes what it believes. Put your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to good use, will you?
As we've learned, humans have many internal biases that affect the way we gain information and look at the world. These biases serve a purpose. They're shortcuts that allow us to spend less time learning and processing information and more time acting on what we know. Confirmation bias is an especially strong bias because we tend to look for information that confirms what we already know and believe, not wasting time with new information and re-examining our view of the world. It's beneficial to be aware of this bias so we can determine if we're actually looking for all the information on a topic. Let's watch a video that shows us some tools that we can use to combat confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias is something that you're probably familiar with, even if you don't know the term. Basically, it means that we seek out information that supports our own opinion. And if we come across something that contradicts it, then we're likely to say, but there's something wrong with this information. How can you combat it? Here are 5 ways. When you're doing your research, make sure that you're seeking out reputable sources. Remember, confirmation bias doesn't just apply to individuals, but entire media organizations. Read about the issue from sources across the political spectrum. Now, this may mean going to websites that you hate, and it also means following people that you'd usually block. Yeah, it's gonna get uncomfortable. If you wanna understand all sides of an issue, you have to hear from all sides of an issue. Actively seek out people with opposing views. Don't argue. Listen, ask them questions. You're probably going to find out that they're not the fools you thought they were. Don't rely on Facebook, okay? Because we normally tend to be friends with people who think the way we do. Shocking, I know. And remember that by design, Facebook is biased towards your beliefs. Try proving yourself wrong. Play devil's advocate. Think about how you would argue the opposite of what you believe. It's easy to keep living in our own bubbles, but that closes us off to new ideas and experiences. So remember that people's opinions are shaped by their own culture and their unique experience, and that can be completely different from yours. Now, if you can figure out the source of your bias and the source of other people's biases, not only will you understand the issue better, you'll probably learn something about yourself.
To combat confirmation bias, we need to be critical of our own thinking process. Things we can do to keep an open mind are check our sources to make sure they're accurate, not just confirming a personal belief. Make sure they're trying to seek information from a variety of sources. Try to see the validity in the opposing viewpoint. If that point of view is wrong, the facts will expose it. Don't rely entirely on social media. The social media sources we rely on are probably made by people who think like we do. And try to prove yourself wrong. This will help us move beyond what we think is true and search for additional facts. Many believe that the press and media are biased, but we have to be careful that we don't label all news sources as biased and therefore inaccurate or untrue. If they were really unreliable, then their product would be useless and they'd be soon out of business. They have a vested interest in providing accurate information. Let's see how we can apply critical thinking techniques to the news media and find factual information that we can use.
A common complaint you'll hear is this: the news media is biased. Public opinion surveys show that more than 70% of Americans often make that claim, and the number seems to rise each year. That accusation is particularly troubling to journalists. It calls into question the very standards of their profession. Journalists are trained to verify information and to be as impartial as possible. That is, to be independent from outside influences and personal beliefs. And one reason news organizations put reporters' names on stories is to ensure those journalists are accountable if they fail to maintain proper impartiality. The goal of this lesson is to define journalistic bias and then to help you spot it. Just as important, however, will be your ability to recognize unfounded charges of bias. Those may prevent you from finding reliable and actionable information. Let's start with the definition of bias. A predisposition that distorts your ability to fairly weigh the evidence and prevents you from reaching a fair or accurate judgment. Notice the word predisposition. That means that the bias comes before the effort to verify and report a story. Based on this definition, how can you go about finding bias in the news media? The essential step: look for a pattern of unfairness. One instance of unfairness may be the result of a number of different causes and may not necessarily be evidence of bias. Perhaps the journalists rushed to share a story and got sloppy. Perhaps obstacles prevented the reporters from interviewing every relevant party. Perhaps they made an honest mistake. Journalists are human, and as in every profession, they make mistakes. You don't assume a doctor is incompetent or worse if she misdiagnoses a patient's illness, but a constant failure to make a proper diagnosis would be proof that she's a terrible doctor. Likewise, if journalists and news outlets demonstrate a consistent pattern of unfairness over time, that should lead you to question their reliability. For example, if a news website consistently shows only unflattering pictures of a politician, it's reasonable to suspect that bias is at work here. Or if a news network time and again only interviews supporters of a new publicly funded football stadium, there's a good chance you've spotted bias. Though bias in the news media clearly exists, be on guard against common flaws in claims of bias. The news media is biased is a blanket statement that is difficult to prove. Be skeptical of the charge that the opinion side of news influences or dictates the reporting. There is a long tradition of commentary in the news media. In professional news organizations, the views expressed on editorial pages do not influence the work of reporters. Be cautious when looking for patterns. The fact that a news outlet covers a controversial story is not evidence that the journalists are endorsing one side of the debate. News editors exercise their best judgment and, as we've seen, take into account many factors when determining just what stories to cover. Covering the trial of an elected official does not mean that the news outlet endorses any particular outcome of the trial. Such a story contains several news drivers, including importance, conflict, and prominence. So it should not be a surprise when it is featured in news reports. The official may charge the news media with bias, but keep in mind that he is attempting to save his own skin. The failure to cover a story is not necessarily evidence of bias either. Editors and producers consider many stories, and their judgment may lead them to exclude certain stories in favor of ones they find more important and more interesting to their audience. To sum up, when attempting to spot bias, look for a pattern of unfairness over time. Compare and contrast coverage across a variety of news outlets, especially when searching for bias that may come from omission. And lastly, take note of the self-interest of those who allege bias. Accusations of bias often come from individuals whose own bias leads them to scapegoat the news media.
News sources can be used as a reliable source of information because their reporters and editors are held accountable for that information. Their names are on the articles. There's extensive fact-checking, and if misinformation is presented, then multiple sources will call attention to it. Rather than pointing at one article and claiming bias, we need to look for a pattern of unfairness over time. We should be able to pinpoint who that bias benefits and who it excludes. And we need to be careful not to dismiss all news as being biased. Many times, when someone accuses a news outlet of being biased, they are in fact biased themselves because they feel the article was unfavorable towards their point of view. Most media outlets try to present factual information, but occasionally false information is reported. This may be done intentionally to mislead people or unintentionally. How can we carefully weigh such information? Let's see what will help us.
There's a quote usually attributed to the writer Mark Twain that goes, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes." Funny thing about that, there's reason to doubt that Mark Twain ever said this at all, thus, ironically, proving the point. And today, the quote, whoever said it, is truer than ever before. In previous decades, most media with global reach consisted of several major newspapers and networks which had the resources to gather information directly. Outlets like Reuters and the Associated Press that aggregate or re-report stories were relatively rare compared to today. The speed with which information spreads now has created the ideal conditions for a phenomenon known as circular reporting. This is when publication A publishes misinformation, publication B reprints it, and publication A then cites B as the source for the information. It's also considered a form of circular reporting when multiple publications report on the same initial piece of false information, which then appears to another author as having been verified by multiple sources. For instance, the 1998 publication of a single pseudoscientific paper arguing that routine vaccination of children causes autism, inspired an entire anti-vaccination movement, despite the fact that the original paper has repeatedly been discredited by the scientific community. Deliberately unvaccinated children are now contracting contagious diseases that had been virtually eradicated in the United States, with some infections proving fatal. In a slightly less dire example, satirical articles that are formatted to resemble real ones can also be picked up by outlets not in on the joke. For example, a joke article in the reputable British Medical Journal entitled Energy Expenditure in Adolescents Playing New Generation Computer Games has been referenced in serious science publications over 400 times. User-generated content such as wikis are also a common contributor to circular reporting. As more writers come to rely on such pages for quick information, an unverified fact in a wiki page can make its way into a published article that may later be added as a citation for the very same wiki information, making it much harder to debunk. Recent advances in communication technology have had immeasurable benefits in breaking down the barriers between information and people. But our desire for quick answers may overpower the desire to be certain of their validity. And when this bias can be multiplied by billions of people around the world nearly instantaneously, more caution is in order. Avoiding sensationalist media, searching for criticisms of suspicious information, and tracing the original source of a report can help slow down a lie, giving the truth more time to put on its shoes.
Though circular reporting news agencies can take information from other sources that may not be accurate and spread it, the media does have the mission to publish the latest and greatest news in a timely manner. So they may rush to report on a story before it's verified. Once a reputable news source reports on a story, other sources may quote them, and the inaccurate information then spreads. This has even happened with sarcastic or joke articles. Opinion articles have been thought to be statements of fact and cited as a source. It's always best to trace the source of a news story to check its accuracy. But what if the news media is reporting on scientific data or statistics? We've already talked about how statistics can be misleading, but let's see how that applies to the news.
So it's no wonder that our news is full of numbers. Whether it's some headline about refugees coming from an international organization, whether it's the outcome of a political poll, or whether it's some groundbreaking new health insight based on statistical analysis. Smelling farts might prevent cancer. Before you get too excited, this one turned out to be bogus. So behave yourselves, please. Also up there. Great. But whatever they are, these numbers, they shape the way we view the world. They tell us what to eat. They tell us what kind of medicines we should take when we get ill. They tell us how the economy is doing and who we should vote for. So it's very important that these numbers, that they are correct, that we can trust them. Sadly, though, many of those statistics in the news that are supposed to inform us, they actually misinform us. As a wise man once said, torture numbers and they'll confess to anything. And our news today, sadly, is full of such tortured numbers. So I think it's time for some statistical self-defense. Today I want to talk about the 5 most common statistical lies that you see in the newspaper every single day. Are you ready? Great. 1, the good-looking graph. You know these graphs that you see in the newspaper, on the news? They just look too good to be true. And quite often, they actually are a bit too good to be true. Take this one. This graph was shown in the American Congress in the midst of a huge discussion about Planned Parenthood, this health organization. And one Republican congressman put this graph up. And he said, look, Planned Parenthood is doing less and less cancer screening and prevention services. The blue line is going down. And the purple line, abortions, are going up dramatically, quite steep. So he said, we should cut funding to this organization because why should we spend our taxpayers' money on things that aren't saving lives? Something weird with this graph, though, because look at the numbers. The upper right-hand corner says 327,000. Below, it says 950,000 and a little bit. You don't really need a PhD in statistics to know that lower numbers should be lower on the graph. So what happened here? This graph uses two different scales. If you put them on the same scale, the message is very different. Okay, cancer screening and prevention is still going down, but abortions have hardly moved. Second statistical line, the polluted poll. Well, we already did quite a polluted poll just now, I think. But there are many other polls out there in the news. This one, for instance. 1 in 4 women experience sex assault on campus. This was a headline in New York Times. And it's incredibly shocking, right? 25% of female college students have to deal with sex assault. Fortunately, though, it's also probably exaggerated. And the researchers admit this. They say there's probably a bias upwards. But the New York Times didn't mention this in the article. So what is the issue here? Well, 3 things. 1, a very small sample of universities participated. 2, at those universities, more than 80% of the women did not respond to the questionnaire. And 3, the definition of sexual assault was a very broad one here. In fact, the researchers they avoided the word assault because it's a very loaded term. So what could happen is that a girl at a party being hit on by a guy and rejecting him, she might be coined a victim by this survey, even though she would not call that assault herself. So someone in the Huffington Post said, hey, maybe the New York Times should have had this as a headline. Approximately 1 in 4 of 90% of non-representative sample of women who responded to a non-representative survey of 2017 reported experience sexual assault. With sexual assault take to mean anything from being on the receiving end of an unsolicited kiss to forcible penetration, gunpoint, regardless of the particular context. I hope you're still awake, because this is not really clickbait material. But it is the more honest story here, right? And I think when we talk about something as serious as sexual assault, we should also take the facts seriously. So third statistical line, the overconfident decimal point. Our news is full of very precise numbers, with 2 or 3 digits behind the decimal point. And that gives the impression that these numbers must be true, objective, because they're so precise. Well, let's take a look at one, kind of the queen of these things, GDP growth. GDP growth is an important number because based on this statistic, economists tell us whether our country is in recession or not. So last year, statisticians in the United States announced that April to June 2015, the GDP growth was 2.3%. A month later, they said, 3.7%. Another month later, said, 3.9%. So it jumped so much in such a short period. Does this mean that these statisticians were not doing their job well? No. What this means is that GDP is incredibly difficult to calculate, and it takes time. Just look at this very boring table. Don't even bother reading it, but just to show you all the components that go into GDP. There are a lot. So it takes time to get good, accurate data on these. So no wonder that these statisticians were revising the numbers as they went. So you might wonder, why should I care? I never liked economics in high school. And, well, this probably didn't make you more excited about it. So why should you care now, right? Well, let me give you an example. 2 researchers looked at 40 years of data in the United Kingdom. And they took an older data set and they concluded there were 10 recessions in those 40 years. With a better data set, so with newer, better data, they concluded there were only 7. So 3 whole recessions disappeared. simply because they got better numbers. And these were periods in which people were fired, in which politicians won elections over bad economic circumstances. Periods in which countries were in complete chaos because of this supposed recession. So maybe you should care. Okay, fourth, the spectacular statistic, or I should say, the not so spectacular statistic. This is kind of the Tom Cruise of statistics. You know, in movies, he looks impressive, right? Wow. Well, the suit really helps as well, but still, you know Tom Cruise, he always looks awesome and powerful and everything. Put him in context, though. Yeah. I prefer the previous one. Anyway, the same goes with statistics. Sometimes you add a little context and they look very different. Take this one, for instance. People who eat processed meat daily have a 20 times higher risk of getting bowel cancer. This was the headline in the Dutch news. Well, a little bit after they said, oops, sorry, it was 20% higher. Quite a difference, but still, 20%, still a high number, right? At least high enough for a lot of media here and in the United States and in other countries, for a lot of media to write about this. But the right question here is 20% of what? Because 20% of a small number is still a very small number. So let's take a look. In the United States now, the chance to get bowel cancer is about 4.4%. If you eat some extra meat, 50 grams, which is about one hot dog, if you eat a hot dog per day extra, that number goes from 4.4 to 5.2%. Already quite less impressive than that big 20% we saw before. Even less impressive it gets when you look at the chance of not getting cancer. Because that is 95.6% in the first case, 94.8% if you eat this extra hot dog per day. Still important information if you decide about your diet, but not as spectacular Tom Cruise-y as we saw before. Last one, the cocky correlation. The fact that two things happen at the same time or happen to the same people, that doesn't mean that one causes the other. Let's take a look at this graph. Annual incidence of brain tumors. This is in the United States, and it goes from mid-70s to mid-90s. And you see something weird happening in mid-80s. You see all of a sudden this graph shifts upwards. It's quite a big shift. And the researchers that published this graph said, hey, what's going on here? And they had an answer. They said, it must have been this. NutraSweet, this artificial sweetener that was introduced in the United States just a couple of years before this big shift in the graph. You know what else happened in the mid-80s? I don't know, Band-Aids? Microsoft Word? I happened mid-80s. So, all very life-changing events, obviously. But still, without any additional information, I am just as likely to have caused that big increase in brain tumors as NutraSweet. And you know what? There was a much more plausible explanation, and that's this. MRI scanners. Before, some brain tumors just went unnoticed because they didn't have the instruments to actually detect them. And now, mid-80s, more and more MRI scanners were around in the United States, so more tumors were actually noticed. So this is only one example where correlation is being mixed up with causality. And to me, this is kind of the most dangerous statistical lie of the 5, because it so easily links to action. Once, for instance, I tell you that TED Talks are super healthy, you might decide to just, spend all your time sitting in theaters like this and watching TED Talks all the time because you want to be super healthy. You might even quit your job. And that's a silly example, of course. But look at this one. This is a graph from Vox.com. and it's about drug-related arrests in the United States. And you see that Black Americans were more than 2.5 times as likely to be arrested for drug-related offenses than white Americans. And the easy conclusion here is, hey, well, being Black must make you a criminal, right? Because look at the stats. And then the action could be obvious. Maybe the police should go to Black neighborhoods, should single out Black individuals, because that's where the bad stuff happens, right? We see it here in the numbers. But look at this one. Black Americans are not more likely to use drugs. They're also not more likely to sell drugs. So that correlation, that should be second-guessed. And probably the whole reason that we see that big difference is those racist police practices in the first place. So I think we should defend ourselves against this cocky correlation and also against all the other 4 statistical lies I talked to you about. Because if we don't watch out, these bad statistics, they end up hurting ourselves, hurting other people, and hurting society. So thank you.
When it comes to statistics, context is king. What is being compared to what? Are you comparing apples to oranges? You need to be careful of graphs that are inaccurate. Perhaps the scale is off. Polls can be imprecise. What if you need to get 90% of the questions on an exam right to pass a course? Would you rather take an exam with 5 questions, 10 questions, or 20 questions? If you got 1 question wrong on the 5-question exam, then you wouldn't pass. Such a small sample of questions would not accurately assess your knowledge on the subject. The same reasoning applies to decimal points. The difference between 2 numbers may be enormous or infinitesimal depending on where you start measuring. For statistics to be meaningful, you need to know the context. 20% of what? And we should always carefully investigate cause and effect. Just because 2 things happen at the same time or to the same group of people does not necessarily mean they're connected. A handy tool we can use is called the CRAP test. We can use this to check the accuracy of information. Let's see what CRAP stands for. So the CRAP test would mean we should check our information to see if it's current, relevant to our subject, comes from a reputable authority, is accurate, and we fully understand the purpose of the source providing it. We can feel confident about using the news media as sources of information as long as we fully check them for accuracy. To avoid media bias, we can use several sources to get a broad variety of viewpoints. That way, we can have the most reliable and up-to-date information. There are many other resources we can use that are available on the internet. As long as we carefully analyze them and use critical thinking skills, we can rely on their information. First, there are old-fashioned books. In the United States, if you have a library card, you can access books online. Project Gutenberg offers thousands of free fiction and nonfiction books. Most of them are older books whose copyrights have expired. You can also find free books as well as movies and music at the Internet Archive. There are also many sites that offer free educational textbooks. Among them are Book Boon, OpenStax, the Open Textbook Library, Sailor Academy, Boundless, Open Sunny, Galileo Textbooks, OER Commons, and Open Culture. There are government websites. These are very accurate when they give information about legal or governmental matters. In the United States, they often end in a .gov address. You can research tax information at irs.gov. You can learn about world conditions using the CIA Factbook. You can learn about science at science.gov. You can research health information at the websites for the Center for Disease Control, CDC, the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the National Center for Biotechnology Information, NCBI. You can access scholarly, peer-reviewed articles online. Many of them are free. Some websites are Google Scholar, JSTOR, SSRN, Core, the Public Library of Science, and the Directory of Open Access Journals. There are many college-level courses you can take online for free. EDX offers free courses from Harvard, MIT, Boston University, and other colleges. Coursera offers courses from many other colleges. MIT also offers MIT Open Courseware. There's Carnegie Mellon Open Learning, Stanford Online, and Harvard Online. Google and Microsoft offer training on their products. You can even pay a fee and receive certification. There's also Udacity, Udemy, Khan Academy, and TED-Ed. You can also access news stations, newspapers, magazines, dictionaries, Wikipedia, and a wealth of other information online. Millions of people worldwide now have access to college-level education online. In fact, many traditional colleges now offer online classes as part of their regular courses. All of these resources are available to students of this school. Take in the information from these courses and research them using online resources. By carefully analyzing your sources and applying what you learn, you'll be equipped with the tools needed to succeed in any career.